different papers. One was looking strictly at the grassroots in Puerto Rico and what were they doing, using a very kind of like an inductive research method, but also not placing planners at the center of the conversation, but also but just trying to think about what exactly our communities doing, and could that be considered planning? And then I did another paper very similarly looking at the diaspora groups, specifically those in Chicago, and how they were mobilizing their networks, their transnational networks to support recovery efforts in Puerto Rico, right? They were sending aid, but also they came here and they supported different municipalities and communities in Puerto Rico. And at the same time, they were dealing with all the displaced people that ended up in Chicago, right? So they were doing disaster recovery simultaneously in two different jurisdictions from the same hurricanes, from the same political context, from the same social situation. So that was something very interesting as well. And then the third paper was more looking at policy and invited spaces and opportunities for communities to participate in disaster planning, post-disaster recovery planning. And I looked at some of the federal programs. Lucila mentioned FEMA mitigation programs, like the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And by the way, Lucila, I think if I remember correctly, you mentioned in one of your, I can't pinpoint exactly what publication was it, but you did mention that FEMA has, after disasters, they have different programs. They have the individual assistance program. They have the public assistance program, which is more targeted to municipalities, agencies, and some nonprofits. And then they have the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which allows for more planning. But they don't have a community assistance program, right? And that's very interesting, right? Because Lucila mentioned that thinking about the 70s, we've had these conversations for 30, 40 years, and we still don't have something like that. That's very useful and would be, at this point, I would say it would be revolutionary because it would change a lot of the ways that planning is being done, especially in the conversations of disasters and relocation and whatnot. But that's something perhaps for another conversation. But in addition to FEMA, there's also HUD, which provides federal funds for long-term recovery, and they have what is called community development block grants, specifically for disaster recovery. That's the famous CDBG-DR funds. And they required some level of planning at the state level, but also they required municipal level planning, and even they allowed for community level planning. Right. So I focused that third paper on those programs, the design of those programs, and to what extent they allow practitioners on the ground to advance more just and humane recovery processes, or if they did the opposite. Right? And again, that's another conversation for some other time. But the third paper, looking at planning in Puerto Rico, that's the one that I eventually ended up turning into a publication. The other two are in the works, but this one, and I titled Bomba Planning, based on Bomba, and I can talk about that a little bit earlier, the Bomba dance and music genre. That is mostly Puerto Rican because it combines elements of the African enslaved that were brought to Puerto Rico, but also the Taino Arawaks, who were the indigenous population in Puerto Rico at the time. And since then, it has had influence from the Spanish and other things. That's what makes it Puerto Rican, right? That combination of those three components. But there are similar genres across the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and even in the Gulf Coast of the US. So that's sort of like introduction. And basically what I try to do, what I tried to do with this article was use insurgent planning as a framework. It's a theory in planning that was developed by people outside of planning, but within planning, there have been several different scholars that have tried to incorporate insurgencies and insurgent historiographies and insurgent action into, could that be understood as planning? And one of my advisors at Illinois, Farhan Miraftab, was one of the first to try to think about insurgencies from the standpoint of planning, and do we understand insurgent movements as planning, and what do they need to, what elements have to be present in order for us to be able to have that conversation. So I try to use that framework. I think it provides epistemological advantage because it allows you to see a few things that are not necessarily always understood from a planning standpoint. I'm gonna get to that in a second, but it's very important for me to talk about the context, right? I'm using insurgent planning as a lens because I wanted to examine the works of the grassroots, like I mentioned, the community groups and different grassroots networks and movements in a context where formal disaster planning, right, what's happening at the institutional level, is most likely to displace and dispossess than to enhance the livelihoods of the poorest and the most marginalized, right? So that's the context. That's what was happening in Puerto Rico. And I introduced the notion of Bomba planning as an analytic device, just basically as a way to try to understand and capture the distinctive features of engagement among grassroots movements in Puerto Rico, specifically in the context of disaster recovery as they pursue a more just and humane recovery. I already talked about a little bit about the context, right? But Puerto Rico is a U.S. colony. It's been a U.S. colony for over 100 years. We've been in basically in financial and fiscal crisis for a very long time. But even before, just right before the hurricanes in 2017, Puerto Rico basically defaulted on its public debt, right? So in a way, it went bankrupt. So it didn't have money to pay the debt and provide the essential services it's required to provide. So the U.S. established a fiscal oversight board to more directly intervene in Puerto Rico's fiscal policy. And then we've had a bunch of other things that's like, people call it compounded disasters. But again, we've been experiencing similar situations since the 30s, right? So it's kind of like the context in Puerto Rico in general is sort of like a disaster context. That's arguable, but you know, we can talk more about that. And then there's a precursor, right? I mentioned I was looking specifically at those HUD funds, the CDBG-DR funds, as part of the broader U.S. disaster policy framework. And I did a research before this I went to different jurisdictions that had experienced similar disaster situations caused by hurricanes, and try to learn how they developed their governance model with all this millions and millions of dollars of funds for long-term recovery and reconstruction. And I visited Louisiana, I visited South Carolina, I visited Florida, Texas, and obviously Puerto Rico. And I sort of like saw different models, governance models that in different ways opened up the space for more participatory planning or more equitable redistribution of funds. Ultimately, Puerto Rico was very centralized at the state level. It was very top down, and it was very much highly dependent on private consultants that were hired by the government because of the lack of institutional and financial capacity at the time to manage this huge amounts of funds and do this huge amount of planning documents and engage communities, reconstruct housing, and you know all that entails. So that's another article that's very interesting. That's the title is "What is Possible: Policy Options for Long-Term Recovery in Puerto Rico," and it compares the different models. This is just a table that to summarize that. And then, so within that context, where formal planning, like I mentioned, is more it's more prone to displace and dispossess the poorest and most marginalized. I started to look at what were some of the responses from grassroots groups that are not necessarily engaging with any sort of professional planning practitioner, or they are not necessarily they don't necessarily have access to any formal space or invited space of action. And insurgent planning, it's a very interesting and useful framework. At least I use it as a framework because it allows us to expand the horizons of planning and look at different spaces, look at different actors, and look at different practices. So through an insurgent planning lens, we have the capacity that we can understand the capacity of planning extended to community organizers, activists, and everyday citizens, not just professional practitioners. Also, the spaces of direct action, right, which could be in collaboration with formal spaces of planning and community engagement. It could be in opposition to, or it could be entirely beyond the purview of formal planning processes, which was happening a lot in Puerto Rico because of, mainly because of the impact of hurricanes Irma and Maria. But also, as you know, disasters are social and political, so this is just a reflection of what has been happening historically in Puerto Rico. And also, it allows us to see practices and meanings that are mobilized by grassroots movements, right? They are not necessarily the traditional values, the traditional planning values that we are taught and that we sort of like want to advance. Some other groups define those values and those meanings, and they use practices very differently, right? So, just the opportunity to be able to capture that. I think that's the value of using insurgent planning to do research. And that doesn't necessarily render all practices to be insurgent. What it allows us is to have this expanded horizon of possibilities of seeing what might be often occluded. And specifically for this article, I narrowed down 3 cases. One is the urban encampments in Caguas. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them. There's a lot more detail in the article. The Feminist Collective Network in Loíza, and then Imaginación Post María, which was a sort of like a regional effort, regional participatory planning effort advanced by a nonprofit organization, but in collaboration with different community groups in different places. So briefly, just to say a few words about these cases, they're all very interesting. They all do a lot of work. I'll be happy to talk a lot more about each of them afterwards or some other time. But it was a combination, in Caguas, there was a combination of urban actors that did a lot of like rescue of abandoned buildings and occupations of abandoned buildings and lots in the urban centers. Some of them were government-owned abandoned buildings and lots. Some of them were privately owned, but they were all abandoned, right? That was the main thing. So these were underused spaces that could provide opportunities for housing, for community organizing, for community kitchens, and for all sorts of things, right? Gardens, etc. They ended up developing a Centro de Apoyo Mutuo, a mutual support center, which then it triggered a movement across Puerto Rico where there were many Centro de Apoyo Mutuos developed in different places of Puerto Rico. They all have their own characteristics that are context specific and need-based. But it was a movement, and it has been documented. There are some articles that talk about that specifically, so I'd be happy to share some of that later. And some of their meanings, right, were not necessarily traditional planning meanings, but the values, what drove their action was the right to the city, but the right to stay and not be displaced, the right to save and protect their community, their organization, and their history, their urban history, and the right to have access to the spaces that they greatly value. So that was a little bit, just to say a little bit, and I talk about 2 main organizations. Urbapié is one of them, and Comedores Sociales is another one, that they sort of like were the poles that brought everything together in Caguas, but there were a lot of other things happening around them. The second case was Feminist Collective Network in Loíza. This was mainly the main organization that I document is Taller Salud, but Taller Salud did a lot of work with community groups in Loíza that were already organized and they were already doing a lot of work in their community. So they sort of like helped enhance and expand what the community groups were already doing. Taller Salud is a feminist organization, but also most of these community groups were led by women in Loíza. And that's sort of like a reflection of that's a reflection of the environmental justice movement in general, I would say. But it was very noticeable in Loíza, and what they did was very interesting because they sort of like reshaped recovery, which is very emergency management oriented. It's very sort of like, it has this vibe of uh, a military operation in a way, and it's mainly thought up by men. Men that are they're white male that are not from Puerto Rico, that don't understand necessarily the context of Puerto Rico, and that has a lot of like implications that doesn't necessarily translate adequately to a local context, specifically to a local context like Loíza. So they reshaped the way that recovery was being thought about in Loíza, and the practices that they developed, feminist practices oriented towards precisely helping women, children, and the elderly, and that sort of had a positive impact on the rest of the community. So that was incredibly interesting. I could talk for days about their work, but I don't have the time. So moving on. The last case was Imaginación Post María. It was more of like a regional effort, and they were very focused. There's this organization called La Maraña. That's the one that I mainly focused on. But again, that was like the center pole. There were a lot of other groups around them that sort of like helped advance different things. And they were a lot about community organizing, capacity building, and participatory planning. But the meanings that they really wanted to advance was self-determination, and the opportunity for local actors to define recovery, based on their own needs, based on their own aspirations. And that's something that's stands in stark contrast with a traditional top-down recovery planning model, which is basically everything is defined by either FEMA or HUD or a disaster declaration by the president and whatnot. So within all that context, right, this is where I introduce sort of like this notion of Bomba planning, and I say it's an anti-colonial and solidarity-based practice, because I'm seeing how grassroots groups in Puerto Rico leverage their local knowledge, right? It's very epistemic in that sense, and that allows them to move across invited and invented spaces of action, right? They can participate in spaces that are sanctioned by the state, but also they can develop unsanctioned spaces where they defend their right to stay in the city, to stay in their communities, to use public spaces in the ways that they find necessary and acceptable, to design ways to satisfy their real needs as they define them, to occupy public spaces and private properties in areas of disinvestment and abandonment, and to participate in collective decision-making. And I sort of like try to develop what I could call like a sort of like a definition of Bomba planning, but it's like a guide really. And I say it's a set of practices and meanings mobilized through invited and invented spaces of action, and are based on a co-constitutive grassroots engagement. And that co-constitution comes from Bomba itself, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it's important that it places context and historical consciousness in the heart of the organizing, right? So it's not from a clean slate. It's not a blank canvas. It places context and historical consciousness at the heart of the organizing. And I don't know, Leslie, if this is going to be possible, but I have a video that I think sort of like can explain a little bit what Bomba is in a way, and sort of like uses, for the purposes of those who are connected and who will be seeing this now or later, to have a better sense of what Bomba is, because that it's something that it's very hard to put into words if you haven't seen it. So I can try to share that.
Yes, please try to share that. You have all the permission to do that, so.
Okay, that's great.
Thank you.
Okay, so just a little before that, a little bit of context. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but just to refresh our memory, Bomba is a Puerto Rican music genre, mainly developed by the West African enslaved people in Puerto Rico during the Spanish colonial period. And again, it's Puerto Rican because it combines elements of the African, but also the indigenous people in Puerto Rico, were the Taino Arawaks, and the Spanish. But again, similar genres have been developed in other places of the Caribbean, Central America, the Gulf Coast of the United States, etc. And at the time, it was an escape valve for the conditions of the enslaved populations in Puerto Rico. It allowed them to communicate release feelings of frustration, anger, and also resistance. It was used for many things, including to plan rebellions. So some people have, if you have heard about Maroon communities and Maroon populations, for example, they have this connection to Bomba and how they use that to plan rebellions and whatnot. There's a lot of literature on that, and extremely interesting. And the three main pillars of Bomba, right? So music genre. So it has three main pillars, and one is percussion, the drumming. Second is the dancing, and the third one is the singing. So let's see if I'm successful sharing this video. Hopefully, please let me know if you can see and hear adequately.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm Matt. We are here in San Juan, Puerto Rico, with its city dance, and this is Bomba.
En la bomba tú haces el ritmo y entonces todo lo demás te sigue a ti.
Estamos bailando en tres áreas que son el corazón de la bomba en el norte: San Juan, Santurce y Loíza.
Es una manera de bailar bien libre. Tú haces lo que en el momento tú sientas, lo que en el momento tú te nazcan hacer. Me ha llevado a quererme, a respetarme, a valorarme. La bomba viene de África, ¿no? De nuestros ancestros los africanos.
Me siento honrada porque yo siento que yo estoy representando a mis antepasados, ¿entiendes? A mis ancestros. O sea, esa era la única forma de ellos expresarse.
Un instrumento, un espacio para rebeliones, ¿verdad? Sirvió antisistémica, antirracista, anti todas esas opresiones que significaba ese sistema esclavista que había en Israel. Hoy en día, la música sigue siendo un espacio de libertad y sigue siendo un espacio político de transformación. A bailar.
Me acuerdo que cuando mi mamá me puso esa ropa, yo me sentí que yo era el video. Yo, ay Dios mío, me encontraba tan bonita. Wow, este es algo con lo que yo me puedo identificar, esto soy yo, esto es parte de mí. Santurce se convierte en el primer lugar de donde estaban ubicados los esclavos libertos. Loíza se vuelve en el pueblo donde mayor concentración de negros hay.
¿Por qué no le hicieron los ritos a los parilleros?
Esta cueva es una muy antigua y es uno de estos lugares a donde las personas escapadas de la esclavitud, como los cimarrones,
Bailar solo pues me gusta también, pero me da mucha más alegría cuando estoy con mi hermana. Y qué alegría, ¿verdad? También estar juntas.
La influencia taína la vemos en los términos como la maraca, el cuá. La maraca, el cuá, mantienen el ritmo constante, igual que los tambores. Y el primo, ese es el que improvisa. Una comunicación entre bailador y tocador.
la familia Cepeda fue una de las muchas familias que
Okay, I think we can stop it there. And then I have another one. It's very short. I'm only going to show 2 minutes of this one.
When is dancing protest?
When it's bomba.
Bomba is a traditional genre of music and dance from Puerto Rico and has made an appearance at many recent Black Lives Matter protests.
In bomba, dancing and protest are inextricably linked. Surprise? Once you understand the music, it makes perfect sense.
So now that we know Bomba's influence today, let's talk about where it came from. And to do that, we have to go back about 400 years. Last year, our friends from If Cities Could Dance traveled to Puerto Rico and filmed this footage for their episode on Bomba dancing. Make sure you check out that episode on their channel.
Bomba was developed in the 16th century by enslaved Africans in Puerto Rico. Enslaved communities would gather to make music, using rhythms and dance to express themselves. They told stories, shared news, communicated revolts, and connected with each other. This process of gathering through bomba was known as bambula, a practice of re-remembrance, re-remembering where you came from and your own sense of humanity.
In other words, they created culture and affirmed their humanity. And that is a powerful form of resistance.
How would you describe bomba to people who haven't heard it before, or haven't heard of it even?
So bomba is the oldest genre of Puerto Rico, tracing back to our African roots. It tells the story of our ancestors. It is meant for healing. It is a time traveling genre. And it's Black music.
Yes. Bomba's roots largely come from Africa, but like so much of Latinx culture, it's a blending of elements from many regions. While most bomba songs are in Spanish, some have words and phrases in other languages, including Haitian Creole and Kikongo. The use of long ornate skirts as bomba costumes also shows incorporation of Spanish influences in bomba today. The Taíno were the indigenous people of Boriquén, their name for the island that is now Puerto Rico. That's also the reason many Puerto Ricans prefer the term Boricua. Taíno influence in bomba shows up in terms like bate, which refers to the dance space.
The use of a single gourd-based maraca also shows Taíno influence. The maraca is used to keep time and is often played by the singer. Huas are sticks, often played against the side of a barril, or the drum used for bomba. Can you talk about the significance of the barril or the drum in bomba and like why this specific drum is used?
The barril, I would say in Spanish, but in English it's barrel. It's made out of a barrel. So it's made out of a rum barrel, cheese barrel, whiskey barrel, like whatever type of barrel you could think of, it's made from that. That's what we had when those enslaved Africans came from the motherland into the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And then they needed their resources because they had all these rhythms, so they used their resources that they had. And what we use when it comes to the skins, it's goat skin.
Yes.
So now we're talking about a type of drum that relates to the djembe family.
Yes.
All those African-based drums.
So, what makes the rhythms of bomba bomba? First, there are two types of bomba drums. The lead drummer is known as the subidor or primo, who plays a higher pitched barril. The other drummers play a buleador and keep a steady rhythm called a buleo. While that steady rhythm is going, a dancer enters the bate by doing a paseo, walking around in a circle to mark their space, ending with a salute to the primo. One of the most surprising things about bomba is that the lead drummer's job is actually to follow. As the dancer begins to dance, the primo follows their movements with the drum, striking to the rhythm of the dancer's steps. It's a conversation. Dancers use common dance moves and improvisations to express their thoughts and emotions. The drummer watches closely, anticipating, following, and giving voice to their movements with the drum.
Okay, I think we can leave it there.
When is dancing protest?
Oops. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, that's somewhat an explanation of bomba and the history and everything that it combines, everything that it entails, the communication. So I'm using that, imagining that as a metaphor sort of like to talk about Bomba planning and to explain a little bit how this grassroots movements in Puerto Rico were advancing a more just and humane recovery, right? And the metaphor sort of like goes like this, starting with the percussion, right? The drumming. Those are, the metaphor goes like, those are the leaders, the organizers and the activists. These are the organizations that want to help and advance in this context of disaster recovery. They want to come in and help, and they want to do community planning, right? So, and then the dancing, it's from the that is done by the residents, the community members, and they at the center of the batey. So the community themselves are the dancers, and the community leaders, organizers, and activists, they are the drummers. And so residents and community members, they enter the batey, the space for the dancing, seeking help and aid, right? This is the context of disaster. So they're seeking help and aid. And with their moves, right, their dance moves, these are like accounts of needs, aspirations, and whatnot. They inform the activists, the drummers, who try to provide as quickly as possible the help and aid needed, right? So that's the communication that the videos we're talking about, right? The dancers are communicating, the dancers, which are the residents, the communities that are affected by the disaster, that don't have access to services, essential services. They come to these spaces seeking help and aid, and then the activists, the organizations, the leaders, they sort of like try to respond as quickly as possible, right? But there's a lot of improvisation, there's a lot of change, there's a lot of communication. So there's some prior knowledge that they all have, in that they can understand, they can interpret what's happening, they can understand what are the needs, they can sort of like read the room. That's part of the epistemic knowledge and privilege that I was talking about earlier. And as the community needs change, the grassroots practices change as well, right? This is sort of like a contextualized, need-based engagement. For example, the immediate aftermath of the hurricanes, everyone was in lack of like access to water, food, gasoline, electricity, right? Those were the basic needs. But then as time went by and people were able to satisfy those needs, other needs arise, like the needs for housing, the needs for recreation, the needs for health, long-term health, education and whatnot, right? So the activists had to reshape what they did. So it's not always the same thing that they're doing. They have to evolve as the needs evolve. And then the singing component, it's a call and response. We didn't get to see that in the video, but it's a call and response thing. Sort of like it happens in jazz also. You might know about it. So and the organizers and activists, they call, right? They make the call with the planning values and meanings. What are some of the values and meanings that they want to advance? It could be right to stay, right to defend their spaces. It could be a just recovery, self-determination, autonomous organizing, and whatnot. And then the residents and community members decide if they want to respond or not. So the activists sing a chorus of planning, meanings, and ideals they wish to advance, and the residents and community members respond by engaging with them. The singing component is the one that adds the dimension of multi-directionality to the grassroots engagement. The activists and the organizers set the stage with the drums and the lead singer, and then the residents and community members enter the batey, express their needs and aspirations through the dancing, but also respond to the planning meanings expressed by the activists and their singing. So that combination of those three elements creates that co-constitutive grassroots engagement that gives way to bottom-up community recovery. And more than a performance, as you saw in the videos, Bomba was developed as a movement, and it was as much about collective memory as it was about the future. And I argue similarly that Bomba planning is a resistance movement in this context of disaster, but also top-down disaster planning and the displacement and dispossession happening through that top-down enforced planning. They have to resist. Right? But it's not just about resisting and protesting. It's also about ideating the future and re-existing. And that requires, a counter-hegemonic stance, but also a propositional strategy, which is why I found these cases very, very interesting. And I went into so much detail in the article trying to explain exactly what it is that they were doing. And this is all happening in invented spaces of action. Of course, they interact with formal planning when it's needed, when the opportunity presents itself. Invented spaces can open up invited spaces also, so that relationship is not a binary relationship. And if if you understand the context of Puerto Rico a little bit, you'll obviously see this, but performance, music, these are things, arts, culture, these are things that are very powerful, and they are used and mobilized to advance different agendas. In this case, my argument is that through Bomba planning, this network and grassroots movements, they are advancing a more just and humane recovery in a context of disaster, but also in a context of dispossession and displacement.